It's a very, very difficult situation right now. And if you're a soldier there in and around Bakhmut, for example, or these other places, I mean, it is a level of violence that we haven't seen on this scale, at least in Europe, since the end of the Second World War. There was a report that came out yesterday that said Russia's casualties in this first year since the beginning of their special military operation surpasses all of their combined casualties in all their wars since the end of the Second World War. So Chechnya, Afghanistan, and all the other places where they've been fighting, they lost more this year than they did in all of those combined. So that gives you an indication of the level of lethality and violence. And of course, we've all seen each day the destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure and attacks on cities, the human misery that's a part of this. Having said that, and that's a pretty blunt assessment of what it's like right now. There is no doubt in my mind that Ukraine is going to win this conflict. Russia has so many different problems that we can unpack here over the next several minutes. It's not going to be easy, but as long as the West sticks together and provides Ukraine what they need, Ukraine will in fact win this war, and it's important that they do. I would like to just, for appropriate historical context, yes, the special military operation, or what some people refer to as the full-scale invasion, started a year ago, last February. But the war actually began in February of 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine and seized Crimea, illegally annexed it, and began extensive support for the so-called separatists in the Donbass region. The reason I highlight this, because number one, this is what failed deterrence looks like. The Russians believed that we would not respond, that we would not be able to stick together. They made a terrible miscalculation because of our unpreparedness. We were still dealing with the retreat from Afghanistan. The UK was a mess domestically. Germany was still building Nord Stream 2. And so the Russians, you could almost see how they would think, we didn't do anything after Georgia. We probably would not respond. And we didn't do anything after 2014, so we probably wouldn't really respond or be able to stick together if they attacked again this past.
If I may interrupt you, would you say the West committed a serious mistake by being so mild about how they reacted towards both Georgia and Crimea in 2014?
It was a catastrophic mistake. This is what failed deterrence looks like. When a potential adversary thinks that you're not ready or are not willing. I mean, we know from 5,000 years of history that they will take advantage of that. So that's one reason that I wanted to highlight the fact that we have to go back to 2014 in terms of when it started. And then, of course, their annexation of Crimea has given them the most important, decisive part of Ukraine. And it changes everything. It gives them an advantage in the economic sphere as well as the military sphere. So, yes, the special military operation started last February, but I think it's important to have the context. And then finally, there still are a lot of good, smart, well-intentioned people that just can't imagine that Ukraine will defeat Russia. It's just too big. But this has been going on for 9 years, and Russia only controls somewhere between 15 and 20% of Ukraine, despite having all the advantages. And so I think when you take a look at that, after 9 years, they still have not sorted out most of their major problems. This is part of the reason why I'm optimistic about Ukraine.
Tell us about the strengths of troops and equipment available on both sides. As you rightly said, there's been a lot of destruction and death and wounded. So on both sides, what actually is the existing strength?
It's hard to know exactly the numbers on the Russian side. There's been a lot of headlines about, 500,000 new conscripts and hundreds of thousands of this or that. I don't believe any of those numbers. I think the Russians probably have total somewhere between 250, 300,000 troops involved in this conflict in and around Ukraine, which is more than what they started with, you'll remember. So they have gone through a couple of iterations of mobilizations, increased conscription. Wagner Group in particular, the private military company led by Mr. Prigozhin, has emptied the prisons. So they have gotten up, I think, somewhere in that range. but that's just raw numbers. That does not equal real combat power. It's hard to say how many their casualties are. You know, the Ukrainian General Staff puts out every day what they think the number is, and they put, I think it's somewhere around 135,000 killed, and then another tens of thousands that are wounded of Russians. I never trust numbers from anybody, even from my own soldiers, just because there's so many ways that these kind of things, the way they get reported, especially on that scale. So even if you cut it in half, though, I mean, that's an enormous amount of loss of life. The BBC put out a map a couple of days ago. It's fascinating, that shows the distribution of where all these soldiers, the dead Russians, originated. And you won't be surprised to learn that almost zero from Moscow. The vast majority of their casualties are happening out in far eastern part of the Russian Federation, or the ethnic areas and the poor areas. Almost no families in Moscow are going to any funerals. I do trust the numbers that I see on vehicles, because British intelligence and organizations like Oryx and Bellingcat, they only credit a destroyed vehicle if they can have a photograph and can geolocate where it's at. So the numbers I do generally trust. On the Ukrainian side, the numbers are, I'm certain they've lost tens of thousands of soldiers killed and wounded. There's no, just given the nature of the combat and the intensity of it, not so many as the Russians, but nonetheless, a huge number of casualties. But they do a good job, I will say, on two things. One, their medical evacuation has improved dramatically over the past few years, and especially this year. Whereas on the Russian side, you see almost no attempt to do what we would recognize as medical evacuation, battlefield treatment. So I suspect that the Russian died of wounds rate is significantly higher than it is for the Ukrainian side. On the other hand, I have no idea how many they really have, because Ukrainian General Staff is very, very disciplined about protecting information. So I don't know how many troops they have. I don't know how many actual casualties they've had. But in a war of attrition, they still have about 2 million women and men of military age that are prepared to step forward. So I don't think we're going to see Ukraine running out of people.
What about the Western tanks and even jet fighters, which have been increasingly mentioned in the last few weeks? Will think they will actually be committed. There was a report in the New York Times today that Western nations seem to be very hesitant to actually follow up on their promises and send tanks to Ukraine. And will it make a difference?
They will make a difference. They are arriving. The U.S. tanks are going to come way late, and I think this was by design or whatever, but the solution that the U.S. chose for this means that these will be tanks that won't arrive probably till the end of the year. So they won't be a factor, except in that I think this was done deliberately by the administration to enable the Germans to go ahead and agree to provide the Leopards. 31 Abrams tanks, that's a battalion in the organizational structure for the Ukrainian army, and they will get put into the fight at some point, but nonetheless, they will not be a factor this summer. The German Leopards, of course, which are coming not only from Germany, but also from Poland and other countries, these will make a difference. The Leo is a very, very good tank. And of course, as you know, the crew, that's what makes it different. It's, do you have the women and men in these vehicles? Are they trained to operate effectively? They will be able to defeat anything that the Russians can put on the battlefield. What is already arriving in numbers are the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, German Martyrs, and other infantry fighting vehicles that are necessary as part of a combined arms team. I suspect that what we'll see is by June, when the Ukrainians launch what I would anticipate will be a significant counteroffensive in the southeasterly direction towards Azov Sea, probably towards Mariupol or Melitopol, for the purpose of breaking the land bridge. They will have at least 3 or 4 brigades of their own equipment, Ukrainian tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, as well as the huge number that they captured from the Russians. And then there's probably a brigade, which is 2,000 to 3,000 troops, 100 or so tanks, and a couple hundred infantry fighting vehicles that make up this, what you could call a European brigade, made up of the French, the German, the British, and American armored vehicles.